Good afternoon. So it looks like we've got people from every. I was trying to think in California. I think it is the afternoon, so I'm gonna stick with good afternoon, and hope that encompasses everybody. Welcome to the this afternoon's webinar. Yeah, we're so glad that you're here. The topic for this afternoon is using teacher leadership style and language to create equity in the classroom. My name is Joe Tilley. I work full-time with the Center for Responsive Schools. I'm a curriculum and instructional designer, and I'm going to be walking you through some of this. I do want to take a moment just to recognize a couple of colleagues that have joined to support me and to support the center. And first is Karen Poplowski, who is the director for the programs department. She is showing up as CRS programs. So if you're looking through your tiles, it'll be the CRS programs tile. And then I also want to take a moment and recognize Miss Jane. Jane Kofi is here with us. She is also a curriculum and instructional designer with the Responsive Classroom programs department. So they'll be here to assist us. Couple of things just to kick us off so that you'll be familiar with a few things that we're going to use. I'm going to give you some information, and then you all are going to have some time to go into some breakout rooms with the Zoom format and use some of those breakout rooms to dig into content a little further. A couple of things about Zoom in case you're not familiar with it, just so everybody can get on the same page. Familiarize yourself with the mute and the video portion down in the left-hand corner of your screen. If there's a slash through it, it means that you're muted. If there's not a slash through it, it means that we can hear you. And so if you would just mute yourself until we're at a place where we're sharing with the whole group. Video is there as well. We love to see people. We love to be able to see you when we're talking to you. But if you're more comfortable with the video off, you are certainly welcome to do that. The chat box, you can click on the chat box. Most of you have already had some experience using that to tell us where you're from and to tell us what your role in school is. You'll notice that in the chat box, you can see right now, you're able to talk with everyone. And so Karen is going to be manning the chat box. So if you have a burning question that comes up while we are talking, if you want to put it in there, I'm going to try to answer those as we go along, but Karen will definitely let me know if there's one that I missed. With that said, let's talk a little bit about what our learning goals for this session are. First and foremost, we want to talk about teacher leadership style and the language that we use in order to create equity within the classroom. We're going to explore some ways to strengthen existing strategies and structures to improve classroom equity. And then we're going to connect with other educators and responsive classroom experts to discuss barriers and potential solutions. So what does all this mean? It means this: we're going to start breaking some of these pieces down. We know that right now there are a lot of conversations going on in schools about equity, from the perspective of how do we have conversations with our students about equity, to how do we make sure that we are creating equity in our classrooms, if it's a socially distanced classroom, if it's a virtual classroom, or if it's a hybrid. So we're going to talk about what these kind of foundational pieces are that responsive classroom teachers use within their classroom, and how we can adjust those things in our kind of newfound reality. With that said, the breakout rooms also, we're going to use those so that you can connect with other educators. Most people that are in the classroom right now, those are the experts. Those are the people that are starting to make this happen. Those are the people we're talking to. Those are the people that we're working with. And so when you're in those breakout rooms, if you've got an idea, if you've got a burning question, that's going to be an excellent time for you to be able to share those things. Give you a minute just to read through what the agenda is. So it's a lot, but the important thing to remember is while the agenda may be long, all of these pieces fit together. And one of the best ways that I've heard it explained is that, you know, right now we're in a place where we've got a puzzle that some of the pieces have changed. And so it's changing what the picture looks like. And so some of these pieces we're having to adjust a little bit for a newfound reality, whether or not that's a hybrid classroom, a virtual classroom, those types of things. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these foundational pieces of the responsive classroom teacher. Then we're going to talk about the different styles of leadership, how that factors in. You'll have some breakout time, teacher language, we'll break that down. You'll have some breakout time, and then we'll kind of put it all together so that we can learn from one another. A couple of things to remember. There's a lot of unknown that's out there right now when it comes to what some of the classrooms are going to look like and what some of the new pieces to this puzzle are going to look like, and that's okay. We're all going to be kind of adjusting as we go along, and we want to make sure that we give ourselves grace. And what we mean by that is just recognizing that sometimes these things are going to change on us, and so we're going to have to adjust those. And we're going to see, just looking at the leadership styles and the language, how important it is to keep that in mind as we go through and we're talking about these unknown pieces and how to create that classroom. A few things to remember just to kick us off. An inclusive and equitable learning environment. When you think about the 4 domains of the responsive classroom teacher, and then you take that responsive classroom approach and those core beliefs, and we're going to talk about those in just a moment, what we end up with are classrooms that embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is the classroom where no matter where the student is coming from, no matter what they've experienced, no matter what they have been taught or they have not been taught, that we create an environment where they can be successful, that there's no requirement for them to walk in and have mastered other things in order for them to be successful in our classroom. And so we're going to talk about that in terms of how do we lay that foundation out so that students do feel that piece. And when it all comes together, you know, that's the type of classroom that we end up with, is one where all students are able to be successful. Give you a moment to just familiarize yourself with our core belief, which is written at the top, and then some of the competencies that are listed at the bottom. So take about 2 minutes, read that, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion around it. The core belief of responsive classroom and teachers that seek to utilize the strategies of responsive classroom, the core belief is that in order for students to be successful both in school and out of school, there's this set of competencies that they have to have some experience with, they have to have some mastery with in order for them to be successful. The important part to remember here and really to process, especially in this newfound reality where we are going to be seeing students from a virtual perspective, we're going to be seeing students in a hybrid perspective, those types of things. Underneath all of these categories, underneath all of these competencies are a set of skills. And those are the skills that we have to think about how to support students with it. For example, if you have a virtual classroom now, or even a socially distanced classroom, self-control is going to look very different. And how we respond to the skills of self-control are going to look very different. And so what we have to think about is when we're going into conversations about our leadership style or our language, are all the skills that are associated with these competencies, because these are big picture umbrella ideas that underneath them have multiple skills. One other thing I do want to say, because I do want to frame this in a way that it hopefully will come together as a whole picture. But these skills that we talk about oftentimes are very contingent upon your classroom. So when I was a classroom teacher, responsibility in my classroom looked different in certain ways than what responsibility looked like in a neighboring teacher's classroom. It's the same way with assertiveness and cooperation. There were little nuances within my classroom. So when you are considering your virtual classroom, your socially distanced classroom, all of those pieces, you have to think about the skills that are specific to your classroom and your need. Okay. And so as we're going through this, we'll talk about that. With that said, take a moment and just, if you've got some paper handy, take a moment and just jot down some ideas around what are some of those skills that immediately come to mind when you think about these competencies that you're going to have to teach and model for your students. So if you're doing a virtual classroom, think about those virtual pieces. If you're doing a hybrid or a socially distanced classroom, think about those pieces and just jot down some notes, because we're going to use that to frame this idea. So take about 2 minutes and jot down some ideas around what some of those skills are. Now that you've had a moment to kind of think in terms of what some of these skills are and what they may be for your classroom, we're going to jump into the leadership style in just a moment. I do want to back up for just a quick second and share with you, I should have shared this when I introduced myself. I was a classroom teacher for several years. I taught special education, and so I did both inclusion and I did pull-out services, and I did at times self-contained special education services. And so I serviced kindergarten through 8th grade. And so I've been in multiple classrooms where I've had to navigate these skills. And so I do know how important it is for us to think in terms of our leadership style. And so even thinking back to when I was in the classroom and how this factored into the students that I worked with. So let's talk a little bit about what leadership style is and how it impacts. And first, we're going to talk about the leadership style and what the responsive classroom teacher is. And then we're going to talk about some of the adjustments and adaptations that we're going to have to make in this new COVID phase. The first thing that I do want to share, though, is oftentimes I think that we are going to find ourselves in a place where at times we're going to do some things like flip-flopping. We're going to be the flip-flopping teacher because we realize that this isn't working or that's not working, or we're going to be a little bit more aggressive in our control and those pieces. And I think the thing to remember here is, again, give yourself grace, because you're going to be learning some of these pieces as you go. But just if you can keep what the ideal responsive classroom leadership style is, then you can get back to it. And so just be prepared to kind of have some of those starts and stops, and that's okay. That's okay. So a couple of things to remember, that your leadership style in your classroom reflects both your management skills and your management strategies. And so these are both proactive and reactive. And that's the thing that is really, really important to remember here, is that if you can stay proactive, then you're not having to react. And so that's why we always say that the responsive classroom teacher is an authoritative teacher. What we're doing is we're proactively working to help students develop self-control and self-regulation. And I'm just going to pause there for a second. Let's just frame this new reality in this idea of self-control and self-regulation. And let's talk about the virtual setting for just a moment. Teaching kids how to not create a distraction because they're turning their cameras on and off, or that they key their microphone right when something is occurring within the environment in which they are there. That control, that regulation is going to look different this time. And how we help students through that is going to be a little bit different. The socially distanced classroom is going to be the same way. Students are going to have those moments where they're wanting to get close to another student, but you know that that's not permissible. And so you have to think about what that control and that regulation is. And a lot of, I think that one of the things to really contemplate and keep in the forefront of your mind is the fact that students are really going to have to learn this control and regulation piece, because we're going to have to rely on them to help us with those pieces, because we're no longer in complete control of the environment, especially from a virtual standpoint. We want to help students understand socially responsible behavior, and, you know, see the way that we frame those first three: helping students, helping students, helping students. That's the important piece here. Not necessarily that we're doing it, and that's the really important piece to remember about the responsive classroom teacher. What we do is we help students to develop these things so that they make decisions that are appropriate. But the way that we do that is we have to think about those skills, those big picture competencies, and then the skills that are underneath it. The responsive classroom teacher does not rely on rewards or punishment. We don't want to reward students for doing what is appropriate, what is expected of them. And we also don't want to get into a place where we are just simply punishing students to a degree that they might shut down. We really want students to understand that their actions will equal their consequences. This is, if I can be blunt and just be very open with you all at this point, I think that from a societal standpoint, this is a conversation that's going to be very intense in a lot of classrooms, about understanding that actions equal consequences. And so if there's an expectation that students keep their cameras on and they're not turning their cameras on, and you're having that conversation with students, then framing that conversation in the fact that the reason you're having that conversation is because they chose not to meet the expectation. That's their action. This is the consequence. We want to frame those conversations in a firm, kind, and consistent way. We want to make sure that we are remaining firm, because expectations keep us safe. They create an environment that's equitable for everybody, so that everybody can be on the same playing field. Excuse me. We also want to be kind with this. We don't want to demean students. We don't want to be aggressive with students to the point that they feel uncomfortable or things like that. We also want to be very consistent. Consistency is really critical for equity purposes. And I think that when we think about these new expectations that are honest from a virtual standpoint, a hybrid standpoint, a socially distanced standpoint, or even perhaps a classroom in which there are no precautions taking place, except for maybe mask on. But think about the conversation that you would have to have if you had a student who was constantly pulling that mask off. How would you be consistent with that? How would you be firm? How would you be kind? Those types of things. And then the last thing that the responsive classroom teacher makes sure to do is not to make assumptions, especially about skills or ability. And if you want to know how to create the most equitable classroom, and I think back to my time in the classroom and sharing space with other teachers, and then having students in a pull-out setting where I was in a small group in a small classroom setting, those types of things. You cannot make any assumptions about what students do and do not know. We live in a technology age, but a lot of students still don't understand how to successfully navigate something like Zoom. And so we have to think in terms of what are the skills that students need, and how do I teach those to them? How do I model those for them? Because regardless of what they should have learned last year or what they should know about the technology, we can't make those assumptions about those pieces. So take about 60 seconds and just, some private think time here, and just process this authoritative aspect of the responsive classroom teacher's leadership style. And then we'll talk about some adaptations that will help during these this new environment that we find ourselves in. So take about 60 seconds of private think time. So we've talked about this idea around a core belief that says there are these competencies that are necessary for students to be successful inside a classroom and outside the school environment. We've talked about the type of teacher that responsive classroom teachers are, and how they help students develop these skills so that they can be successful in the classroom. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about some of the adaptations that are going to need to take place. But the thing that I want to say before we talk about this is, more than anything else, you must be kind to yourself and recognize that there are going to be times in which this is going to be an imperfect science, meaning that there will be days when you aren't going to be consistent, or that you do try to reward your students because you're trying to get their attention and those types of things. And so as you reflect on it, learn from it, ask your students what's working, ask your students what's not working, but be kind to yourself, because these are going to be imperfect adjustments as you go along. So what are some of those adjustments? First, you're going to have to consider whether or not you need to release more control. And what I mean by that is, when you teach or model, preferably teaching and modeling skills for students, in order for them to have success with these competencies, you're going to have to expect them to do it. So if you model for them how they are supposed to be conducting themselves during a virtual classroom, such as Zoom, then you're going to have to release the control to them to do that, because you may have 25 students. And so are you going to monitor every student's microphone, every student's chat function, while you are presenting? And so you just have to think about how you're going to release that control in an appropriate way, which means that you're probably going to have to create higher expectations for your students than what you have ever done in the past. And again, this just goes back to modeling for students what they're expected to do, and then having a really high expectation that they meet that. And I do, again, just want to frame this whole conversation around this idea that we are creating an environment, even during this pandemic situation, we're still creating an environment that is equitable for all students. And so when we teach those skills, we model those skills, and we expect it, that is still being equitable for all students. Again, just being more forgiving of yourself and your students. Understand that things are going to happen, and that's okay. We've talked about understanding that there's these new skills in the socially distanced classroom or the virtual classroom. Also recognizing that skills may change over time. And you know, if we end up in a situation where for 6 weeks we have been virtually learning, and then schools open back up because it's deemed safe to do so, then those skills are going to change, and you're going to have students that are going to come in and they're going to be used to being at home, perhaps in a very comfortable environment, kicked back on their couch with their laptop in their lap, and now they're expected to sit in a chair sitting up, and those types of skills change. So just be recognizing that as you're going along, those skills may change. I think understanding anxiety and the role that it's going to play in a lot of these skills, a lot of the behaviors, and a lot of the actions, because there's going to be a level of anxiety that you are obviously going to have. There's going to be a level of anxiety that a lot of your students are going to have. And not only, and this is always something that is, I think, kind of critical to keep in the front of your mind when you're talking about this anxiety piece. Anxiety is going to be around the normal things, such as I'm struggling with math, and now I'm being taught math, and that creates anxiety for me. Now we're going to have anxiety of, oh my gosh, everybody is going to see where I'm sitting in my home because I've got my computer in front of me. And the anxiety of, I really hope my little brother doesn't come running in here while I'm trying to learn. And those are the types of things that also can be driving some behavior. And so if you have a student who suddenly turns their camera off, it may be because something occurred in that environment where they were afraid it was going to be distracting. And that's a skill, that's a skill that we learn as adults. And this is that higher expectation piece. And some of the little students, our younger students, they may need a lot of grace when it comes to some of these pieces, especially if you're in a socially distanced classroom, because I can remember when I was co-teaching in the younger grades, those kids every morning want to hug, high five, give you a fist bump, something. They love to have that physical interaction. And, we're going to be denied that, and they're going to be denied that. That's going to be a little bit anxiety provoking. And so just thinking about how to support students in that area of those types of skills. And then lastly, always remembering that when it comes to the way that a responsive classroom teacher is designing their management style, their skills, their strategies, it's always working to support students and not to punish them. What we want to do is figure out why it is that student is not appropriately socially distancing within our classroom, or why a student is not engaging, or whatever the case is. We want to support those students, and we don't want to put them in a situation where they feel like they're being punished. So that's a lot of information, and I think it's a good time for us to take a moment and talk to some of our colleagues about some of this information. So what I'm about to do is I'm going to send you out into Zoom breakout rooms. You're going to be in groups of about 4 to 5. And I'm going to let you just kind of consider this question that's up there, and give you approximately 5 minutes to discuss things. If you find that in your group there's a question that comes up that you would like my help or Jane's help or Karen's help, and remember, Karen is listed as CRS programs, in the chat function, you can find us and you can send us a private chat, and we would be happy, during this time, to try to answer some of those questions. So again, you're thinking about creating this diverse classroom where everyone has an equitable chance, and just talking about some of those strategies. I hope you had an opportunity to share with some other colleagues some ideas around this. And so the next piece that we're going to talk about is the teacher language piece. And before we do that, I do want to just draw attention to the idea around the developmental considerations when it comes to some of these skills. As I mentioned earlier, I have taught kindergarten through 8th grade. And, this virtual environment puts a real pressure on a kindergartner to understand how to navigate computers, and they're going to be fascinated at the fact that they can see themselves, and they're all of those things. And you're going to have to think about what some of those developmental considerations are. You may determine, if you're doing virtual learning, you may determine that it is best that you ask students not even to turn their cameras on, because it may be too distracting for them. And so those are the types of skills that we're talking about when we talk about this. So the next piece to this big puzzle is the idea around teacher language. And before I go into this, if you will permit me to share with you just a quick little anecdotal story. When I started my responsive classroom journey, I had a fantastic mentor who was talking to me one day, and she shared with me that the responsive classroom journey is a lot like going home one afternoon and sitting down and realizing you don't like your couch. It just doesn't feel good anymore. So you replace your couch. But then you realize, you know what, now the curtains don't match the couch. And so you change the curtains. Then you don't like the paint color, so you change the paint color. Then you don't like the carpet, so you turn it into hardwood floors. That's what the responsive classroom journey is. It is looking at what makes the environment work for everybody. It's constantly changing. It's checking to see, does that couch still feel good, or do I need to change? And teacher language is one of the most important pieces to this puzzle. It's one, and for me, it was my couch. It was where I started my responsive classroom journey, because I realized how important the way that we communicate and talk to our students is. And so we're going to talk about what some of these big picture pieces are. We're going to talk about the adaptations, and then you're going to have a chance to go into some breakout rooms and have some conversations. First and foremost, I think it's important to remember to lead and speak with your students with empathy, because there's going to be a lot of focus on what is no longer. And what I mean by that is we're going to have to spend quite a bit of time as educators making sure that our students are safe, making sure that our colleagues are safe. And so the way that we would allow a student to go to the bathroom is now changed. The way that we would comfort a student who was having an issue within the classroom is now going to change. So all of those pieces are going to be adjusted based off of what still can be. And so leading and focusing on that is really critically important. And so just making sure that we have that opportunity to really focus on those things so that we can give a picture to students about what still is. It's a new environment, but it's still our environment. And it's an environment that we can put everybody in and we can be successful and we can still learn in. And so really digging into what these teacher language pieces are and how they impact the classroom is going to be really important. So, hey, I think it fits pretty perfectly that we had that little technical difficulty and we're talking about speaking with empathy. So I apologize for I apologize for that, but you know what? These are the types of things that are going to happen. And so recognizing that, you know, it's an opportunity to teach and to still think about those skills, because you're going to have some technical difficulties when it comes to it. So again, thinking in terms of focusing on what still is and really framing that fits perfectly in with this idea around envisioning language. You may start calling your students virtual learners. You know, you may start framing it in that welcome virtual learners and those types of things, really framing it in that positive piece where you're using those concrete images to get students to understand what it is that's expected of them. And this is going to be really important within the classroom, regardless of whether or not you're sitting behind a screen and talking to students, or you're sitting in a classroom that's having to be socially distanced. Still making sure that you're setting the stage where you are creating that vision for what is to be. I think reinforcing language, and just as a reminder for what reinforcing language is it's seeing what students are doing well, what is working well, and noticing those things. So for example, we had this little hiccup with the technology, and a really positive way to reinforce that is to say something like, I noticed that we had an issue with technology, but you all came right back on to the meeting and we continued and picked up where we were. Focusing on what those skills are that are really positive is going to be incredibly important during this time. Being able to notice things in the classroom that's socially distanced. Today I noticed that all of you stayed in your seat and you worked together, but you didn't invade somebody else's personal space. Really focusing on what those skills are that they're doing well and reinforcing it, and remembering to use I notice language. Reminding language, again, I think language is probably the biggest tool in our toolbox when we're working with students. And I think when we think about creating an equitable classroom, regardless of having to sit 6 feet apart with dividers between us or sitting behind a computer or things like that, that reminding language is a really equitable opportunity for all students. Because what we do is we say to them, I'm going to remind you of what the expectations are, and not everybody's on the same playing field. And I always think about, I used to do a lot of presenting for the responsive classroom, and I would have to travel everywhere. And no matter how many times I got on a plane, I had to hear the same safety announcement. And it was to remind people, make sure you've buckled your seatbelt, make sure you've got your stuff stowed away. And that is a way to get everybody on the same page. I mean, it's a very equitable opportunity to get everybody on that plane situated so that we can take off. And it's very similar to what you're going to be doing from a virtual standpoint, or the socially distanced classroom. You're going to get those students, those passengers ready by reminding them of what is to be expected. And then redirecting language. I want to say a couple of things about redirecting language that I think is going to be particularly important for this new environment. I think we need to consider redirecting as whole group. And so if you're noticing that several of your students have turned off their camera, then it might sound something like, during this portion of math, we have our cameras on. That might be the redirecting language that you use. I would caution you against picking somebody out of the tiles that are around the computer and say, turn your screen on. Because now everybody's trying to find that person. They're trying to figure out why it was that they turned their screen off, so on and so forth. So thinking in terms of redirecting, make sure that it is appropriate for the entire group. So you've got enough of the population that you need to redirect. Perhaps you're in a classroom that's supposed to be socially distanced, and you're noticing that kids are congregating together to work. The redirecting might be to get their attention, and then simply to say, I noticed that you all are excited for this project, but remember, we have to stay 6 feet apart. And so it's appropriate for everybody. It's empathetic. You're noticing the fact that they're excited, those types of pieces, and you're redirecting them. And I think the redirecting language, just don't panic. I think that's the big thing here, because your students, oh goodness gracious, those little kids, those kindergarten, first, second, third graders, they feed off the energy that you have. And so if you've got a little bit of panic in your voice, they'll have a little bit of panic in their anxiety will go up, so on and so forth. So just thinking in terms of how to use that redirecting language so that you can redirect whole groups in an appropriate way, because this language is going to change. So let's talk a little bit about some of the changes, some of the adaptations that are gonna have to take place. I think really considering your envisioning language before you ever start working with your students. I recommend, if you've got a colleague that you can talk to, or you've got, if you've got a group of colleagues, I think it would be fantastic to do trial runs with your virtual learning. How does it sound? What does it feel like? Can you set the stage and the vision for that? And if you're in a classroom where you've got students that are having to be 6 feet apart, or they're having to sit in dividers, think in terms of how you set the vision for the success of that. I'll tell you right now, as a second grader, if I walked into a classroom and I got to sit in a desk that had, a divider around it, the first thing I'm going to do is start playing with that divider. And so as the teacher, as the leader in that class, what is the vision I'm going to set for those students? How am I going to get those students to understand what this new environment is going to be? You can also use your language to make sure that kids understand sometimes things will pop up and they won't know what to do. And they need to know what that skill is. Do you want them to use the chat function to send you a private chat? Then you have to teach them that skill. If you want them to click their microphone and interrupt you, then you have to teach them that skill. So you have to think about the stage that you want to set and use that envisioning language. Understand that there's some new limitations on what you can see and what you can't see. Even in a socially distanced classroom, you're still trying to figure out if students are working in the way that they're supposed to be. Know your limitations. Go into it knowing those limitations so that you keep your language in a place where it still remains positive and focused on what is. And so you may have to think in terms of, do you want, for example, if we were doing a math problem and I wanted to check your work, do you want all students to hold their work up to the camera? How are you going to check to see for understanding? In a socially distanced classroom, you may have to move around and monitor more. And so thinking in terms of that reinforcing language and the limitations that might come with it. Using your reminding language more often probably than what you are used to. I think this is going to be something that we're going to see a lot of need to stand at a door as students enter and remind them where they are again. Hey, remember you're at school now, so you're gonna have to stay 6 feet away from other people. You know, using that reminding language, kicking those classes off. Welcome virtual learners. I wanna remind you before we begin that if you need to turn your camera off, do so, but come back as soon as you can. Keep your microphones off unless there's a question that you have to ask. Use the chat function, whatever that reminding language is that you want to do. And you may have to remind a lot more than what you're used to. And then the last piece, just talking about this redirecting language, one last thing is just really consider whether or not it needs to be done. And what I mean by that is thinking in terms of what is occurring, just considering, is this something that I need to redirect everybody for? And if it's not, then redirect a student. But if it's a majority of the class, then redirect them. And you may just get everybody's attention for a moment and say, you know, let's do an energizer, let's do a brain break, let's do something that kind of changes up what we're going to do. Because I think I can safely say that just in the time that we've been together, there's a lot of information that we've exchanged. Whether or not it's come from me, it's come from these slides, it's come from you writing notes, remembering back, working with colleagues. Think about all that information and how that can factor into actions and behaviors. So with that said, we are going to move into breakout rooms again to consider this idea around using your language to create a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment. And what are those adjustments? Really thinking about your student population. You know them better than I'll ever know them. What do you need to do in order to meet their needs? And so with that said, Karen, if you would, please open up the break rooms and we'll send you out for about 5 minutes. Welcome back. Welcome back. I hope you had an opportunity to talk with some of your colleagues about some different strategies and some different ideas around language and teacher leadership style and the way that they impact one another and how they interact with one another. Our language really sets the tone for our classroom. And so, you know, really digging into that and even noticing that, you know, something as simple as reinforcing when students come back from a breakout room. I noticed that everybody is back and ready to learn as virtual learners. Just something like that can constantly be reinforcing what they're doing well, I think is going to be really important. So let's talk a little bit about just putting all of this stuff together. The leadership style, the core, the competencies, all those skills that are associated with it. Let's talk a little bit about putting it all together. So first and foremost, don't fear this change. It's coming, it's here, it's going to happen. And if you are anxious about it, then that anxiety will probably come in the form of your students as well. And so embrace it. Figure out what is and what can be. This is true if it is Zoom that you're using, or you're using Google Classroom, or you're using, you know, a socially distanced classroom, or even a hybrid classroom. You know, just don't fear that. Embrace it. Talk to your students. Some of our students know more about Zoom than we do, and talking to them about what works for them, and thinking about those skills, noticing what they're doing well, what they're not doing well, noticing whether or not that is, you know, important. One of the things I was presenting via Zoom last week to a group, and they had their resource book in front of them. And so often what I would see on the screen was this with the head down. And it was because they were looking at something in the resource book. And so thinking about what that new skill is, and noticing that I don't know what you're looking at when you look down, and you're going to have students that are that way, you know, and reinforcing what they're doing, and notice and really embracing the fact that you may not have control over that, and just know that. Um, Again, just talk to your students. They'll tell you what's working for them. I guarantee you they'll say, this is really good, I don't like this. And thinking in terms of how you can adjust things based off of that. And that is both your leadership style as well as your language. I can tell you, in working in particular with middle school students, when you ask them things about what it is that you notice about the way I talk to you, they'll tell you the things that really key them in versus the things that they don't care for. And, talking to them about those. I cannot stress enough creating and using sentence stems for yourself, keeping those handy, making sure that you've got a resource that's available to you to know how to use language such as I notice or before we begin, who can tell me, those types of things, and keeping those sentence stems close to you so that you can use them in the appropriate times. I'm using a laptop right now to communicate to you all, but I could put Post-it notes around my laptop to remind me to say this or to do this or react that way. And you wouldn't know that that's what I was looking at. So just thinking in terms of those sentence stems, I think that can be really, really important. If you've got an issue that really is taking place, you've got a situation where a student is just determined to make sure that there's somewhere in the home that's going to be distracting to people. Engage your families. Talk to them about that virtual environment. If you've got students that are not doing well at school with social distancing, engaging those families. Can you reinforce this at home so that we can reinforce this skill? One of the most important things that I learned in my career in education is that the classroom environment, whether or not it is in person or it is virtual, is different from any other environment that we'll ever be in. And I'll give you an example of how this plays out. When we talk about assertiveness, it's a competency. And within the classroom, one of the ways that we assert ourselves is when we tell the teacher or we tell other people that I have a problem, I'm struggling with this math problem. And at home, that student may be downstairs playing video games, and when they get hungry, they're assertive by screaming upstairs that they want something to eat, and somebody brings them something to eat. And so at home, the skill of assertiveness is just to blurt it out. So they come to school, when they blurt it out, you got to figure out, hey, what is going on here? And then sometimes you got to talk to those families. Hey, I need you to help me reinforce this. And so thinking in terms of those skills, because those classroom skills, even if it's Zoom, if it's in the classroom, if there's dividers, if there's mask on, all of those skills are being taught in an environment that is going to be different than anywhere else they go. And so just think about those types of pieces and think about how your families can help you with that, because there may be some skills they can reinforce at home. And then lastly, just remember to be patient with yourself. Be patient with others, be patient with your students, be patient with the skill set and those competencies, and just lead with empathy. Because if you lead with empathy and you're patient with your students, you're going to create equity for everybody. Because what you're going to do is set the stage for everybody to be successful, no matter what their background is, no matter what knowledge they bring, no matter what skills they have or don't. And so when you're able to create that equitable environment, then what it does is it allows you to have those conversations where you reinforce those skills. So with that said, we're gonna go back into our breakout rooms and just have a kind of an open conversation around this idea of, as you've thought through this, what are some of those action steps that you're thinking you're going to have to take? It may be that you need to create sentence stems, because having those sentence stems ready to remind students of what virtual learning is going to be could be critical for success. So just thinking through what some of those action steps are. You'll get about 5 minutes again to have these conversations, and you should get a invitation. All right, welcome back. Again, I hope you had an opportunity to talk with some of your colleagues about your language, your leadership style, and some of those action steps. And I hope that it was helpful to share that and to hear some action steps from other people. I do want to take an opportunity to draw your attention to the fact that in some ways we are creating a new language for our students. And what I mean by that is we are creating a new way to talk to our students about the skills that they need, about these competencies, and how to be successful with it. We're going to have to model a lot of these things for students. Again, because the classroom environment is going to be different than what the non-classroom environment is. So even if you have students that are used to getting on camera and to talk to one another through something such as Zoom or FaceTime or something such as that, there's still a new language that you're going to have to teach your kids about the skills that are going to be required for that. So thinking in terms of putting this all together, to close us out, we're going to talk a little bit just about putting this all together. And so just from a closing reflection piece, I'd like for you to take an opportunity, take a few seconds to think about this, and then just find the chat box and use it to share a word or a short phrase that illustrates one of the key takeaways for you. I'm noticing a lot of words and phrases that would set a firm foundation for an equitable classroom. So let's circle back and let's think about where we started. We started this conversation thinking in terms of what is equity and how do we create it? How do we use the way that we manage our classroom and the way that we use our language? How do we use that to create an equitable classroom? And again, I say to you that the way to an equitable classroom is to make sure that we set the stage for everybody to be successful with the skills that they have. So with that said, I do want to take a moment to thank you for being here. Thank you for your attendance. You're going to get a recording of this webinar so that you have it for your resource later. I also want to give you some resources that I used in preparing for today. So these two books will really help you from a leadership style perspective if you're looking to create discipline within your middle school classroom, and discipline being the positive aspect of it, that regulation and control piece. Seeing the good in students is a really fantastic a resource, as well as teaching self-discipline is a fantastic resource for for you to use as a resource to help with your leadership style. And then from a language perspective, I tell you, the power of our words is just one of the most fantastic resources that's out there. If you look to the right of the slide, you'll see the power of our words. That's the really in-depth, just giving you a lot of information about language and how it helps and how it works. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see the power of our words that is geared toward middle school. But I will tell you that this is just a fantastic resource. It's got so many sentence stems in it. As a matter of fact, I have my copy right here because it's just such a fantastic resource that you can use. Some new things that we've got out there that you would want to take a look at, especially if you are a school leader and you're working with others. We have some fantastic new additional resources that you can get that will help you to coach other. They're quick coaching guides, and so they'll help you with teachers. If you are an educator and you're looking for something to help yourself, like to coach yourself, you can use this for those purposes as well. A couple of other resources that I'll key you into is we do have some fantastic upcoming webinars on some different topics that that I think that you would greatly enjoy. We have some additional, Jane, for example, is going to be doing one coming up. And so we have some fantastic webinars that are there. You can go to our website and you can go to the printables, and you'll see at the top of this slide is the the address for it online. And we've got resources from our books, graphic organizers, and then planning guides. If you're looking for some stuff, these are all things that you can print off and use for your own resources. And then we also have our journal, our SEL journal, that is available as well. And so, you know, there's just tons of resources that are out there. The last resource that I'll give you is myself. And so what I will say to you is, if there's a question that you have, I'll be happy to stay on here for a few minutes and answer any questions that you want to stick around and ask. You can also email me. I am so blessed to work with incredible people. And so the questions that you send me, I may send you to somebody else who is much more an expert on things, but I will get you in touch with somebody who can answer your question if I can't. But my email is there. It's joe@responsiveclassroom.org. Again, our website is responsiveclassroom.org, where we've got tons of resources that are printable and other things that you can purchase through our website. So with that said, I want to thank you for your attendance. I want to thank you for your participation, and I will stick around for a few moments. And if you have a question, just stay on. And if not, have a fantastic and safe evening.